So my presentation is going to be on the 8 cranial bones. So the cranium is one of the most important parts of the axial skeleton of vertebrates. That is the part of the skeleton that includes the skull, the ribs, and the spine. The cranium is the bony structure that protects the brain, and it's important for us to know the structure of the cranial bones in order to get an idea of how our body uses bones to protect sensitive organs, as well as how it gives our body form. I'm going to be talking about the cranial bones and their different functions. First, I'll talk about its key role, and then I'm going to get into the more particular details. So the occipital bone forms part of the base of the skull. It's right over here, this back part of the skull. It surrounds the foramen magnum, which is a hole right here. Foramen is basically a hole or an opening in a bone. It usually allows for blood vessels or nerves to pour through in order to nourish organs, tissues, and bones. The foramen magnum is a hole at the base of the skull through which the spinal cord passes through and connects to the brain. So this right here. The occipital condyles, which are these parts right here, are adjacent to the foramen, and the skull articulates with the first cervical vertebra here. The posterior and exterior surface of the occipital bone bears a number of prominent ridges, as you can see here. The external occipital crest, over here, extends posteriorly from the foramen magnum, ending in a small midline bump called the external occipital protuberance. Two horizontal ridges intersect the crest, known as the inferior and superior nuchal lines. These lines mark the attachment of muscles and ligaments that stabilize the joints between the first vertebra of the skull at the occipital condyles, which help balance the weight of the skull over the vertebra of the neck. The internal jugular vein passes through the jugular foramen, which are these holes right over here, in order to drain venous blood from the brain, which is blood that's returning to the heart. The hypoglossal canals over here, they start at the lateral base of each occipital condyle, just superior to them. So the condyles are over here and the canals are over here. What's so cool about the hypoglossal canals is that the nerves that run through them control the muscles of the tongue. So the concave internal surface of the occipital bone closely follows the contour of the brain. The grooves follow the path of major vessels, and the ridges mark the attachment sites of membranes or meninges that stabilize the position of the brain. So next we're going to move on to the parietal bones, which is on the side of the skull. So you can see this is one parietal bone, and then the other on the other side. So the parietal bone forms part of the superior and lateral surfaces of the cranium and form major parts of the calvaria, which is just a fancy way of saying skull, or the skull cap. The external surface of each parietal bone has a pair of low ridges, the superior and inferior temporal lines, which you can see this area over here and over here. These lines mark the attachment of the temporalis muscles, which are large muscles that close the mouth. The smooth parietal surface superior to these lines is called the parietal eminence, which is like a bump right over here. It has one on the other side as well. The internal surfaces of the parietal bones retain the impression of the cranial veins and arteries that branch inside the cranium. So now we're going to move on to the frontal bone, which makes up the forehead right here and is separated by a suture, the coronal suture. The frontal bone forms the forehead and the root of the orbits, or the holes in which your eyes sit in, right here. It gives the skull shape and supports many of the muscles in your head. During development, the bones of the cranium form through the fusion of separate center of ossification, and at birth these fusions have yet to be completed. And we'll be back to the sutures in a minute, but for now we're going to talk about the temporal bones, or temporal bones, right here. One's right here and the other one's over here. The temporal bone forms part of the wall of the jugular foramen and houses the carotid canal. The thick vitreous part of the temporal bone houses the tympanic cavity, containing the auditory ossicles, which are made up of 3 bones, the malleus, incus, and stapes. Together, these auditory ossicles transfer sound vibrations from the tympanic membrane or the eardrum to a fluid-filled chamber in the inner ear, which is where the semicircular canals and the vestibule is. So that would be this area right over here. So the sphenoid, we're going to be talking about the sphenoid now, which is located right over here. The sphenoid contributes to the floor of the cranium. It is found behind the eye and below the front part of the brain. It is shaped like a bat or a butterfly with its wings extended out. It is the bridge between the cranial and facial bones. Optic nerves pass through the optic canal in the sphenoid to reach the brain. Pterygoid processes form plates that serve as sites for the attachments of these muscles that move the mandible and the soft palate. So now we're going to talk about the ethmoid bone, which is an irregularly shaped bone that forms part of the orbital wall and roof of the nasal cavity. So it's going to be found right over here. Basically, it's like a square bone that is found at the root of the nose. The cribriform plate of the ethmoid contains perforations or olfactory nerves. A very important ridge is called the crista galli, which separates the right and left sides of the cribriform plate. These are nerves that send signals to the brain from the smell receptors in your nose. The perpendicular plate forms part of the nasal septum right here. So the cranial fossae are found at the base of the skull. They are essentially depressions on the floor of the skull, which house important structures of the brain. For example, the anterior cranial fossae houses the projecting frontal lobes. So now we're going to talk a bit about the sutures, which are these zigzaggy sewing patterns on the skull. So sutures are lines of junctions or immovable joints between 2 bones of the cranium. They are joined together in a sewing pattern. At a suture, the bones are joined firmly together by a dense fibrous connective tissue. So you can see all of the sutures over here and there. There are 4 sutures. There's the lambdoid suture, the sagittal suture, which goes right here across the middle. There's the coronal suture over here, and the squamous suture over here. So the lambdoid suture arcs across the posterior surface of the skull, separating the occipital bone from the parietal bones over here. So it's right there. 1 or more sutural bones may be found along the sutures. They range from a bone the size of a grain of sand to one as large as a quarter. The sagittal suture, found here, posteriorly begins at the superior midline of the lambdoid suture, right there, that's where it starts, and extends anteriorly between the parietal bones to the coronal suture, right there. Anteriorly, the sagittal suture ends when it intersects with the coronal suture. The coronal suture crosses the superior surface of the skull, separating the anterior frontal bone from the more posterior parietal bones, right there. On each side of the skull, the squamous suture makes the boundary between the temporal bone and the parietal bone of that side. The squamous suture can be seen here, where they intersect with the lambdoid suture, right there, and right here. So this is the lambdoid suture, right there. And that concludes my presentation. In the presentation, you learned that there are 8 bones that make up the cranial bones. You also learned that there are depressions in the skull called cranial fossae, which make room for other structures of the brain. And then you learn that there are these things called sutures, which hold together the different cranial bones in a sewing-like pattern. Thank you for watching.